In this video lecture, we're going to look at the functional anatomy of the digestive system going from the mouth to the stomach. In the next video, we'll continue on our trip through the GI tract and talk about the small and large intestine. So here we're going to look at the structure and function of some of the structures associated with the mouth. Then we'll talk about the esophagus a little bit. Then we'll move into the stomach and spend most of the time there talking about its structure and function, and then how both hormones and nervous system help regulate gastric secretions. So starting up the mouth. The mouth, of course, is also called the oral or buccal cavity. It's lined with stratified squamous so that we've got a nice protective layer that can deal with the roughness of the food and can have cells sloughed off and still have underlying cells below it, so that way we don't break the surface and allow bacteria to get into deeper tissues. The tongue, of course, is made of skeletal muscle. To move the food around and then to help in reposition it so we can chew. It also contains different kinds of papilla. The papilla help roughen the surface of the tongue for licking food. And we know, think about a cat who has very large papilla. These are cone-shaped structures, and so the cat uses, of course, that very rough tongue to be able to comb its fur. We don't do that, of course. So we don't need as big a papilla, but the papilla do also house the taste buds so we can taste the food that we're eating. The tonsils are also located in the mouth. There you can see the palatine tonsils here, and then the lingual tonsils on the base of the tongue. These two tonsils are used to help protect the body from microorganisms that we ingest, because they house a great number of white blood cells and thereby protect us from those nasty bacteria. The teeth are, of course, used for mastication, or fancy way of saying chewing. They consist of two different sets. We've got one set as our baby teeth, or our primary dentition. Those show up at about 6 months of age, and then they continue to erupt until they're kids about 2 years old. By the time they get a full set, if they've got 20 teeth in their mouth. The permanent teeth show up later. They replace, of course, the baby teeth and end up consisting of 32 teeth. The types of teeth that we have, of course, are the incisors. Those are used for cutting. Canines first. Canines aren't used for sucking blood, although, all the vampire movies would make you think that's all they're good for. Actually, we use canines for tearing. And then premolars and molars together are used for grinding food. And of course, the molars, remember, can also include the wisdom teeth. The salivary glands consist of 3 pairs: the parotid, the submandibular, and sublingual. It's the parotid gland that swells in the childhood disease mumps, which is caused by a virus. Mumps in adult males increase the risk of causing sterility since the virus may infect the testes as well as the salivary glands. So that's an important reason to have children immunized against mumps as a child, so that they don't have the risk, or at least males don't have the risk of infertility. The saliva that the salivary glands produce consists of water and mucus to help lubricate the food and soften it. It consists of lysozyme that inhibits bacterial growth and prevents tooth decay. Hopefully you remember lysozyme from somewhere else, see if you can remember what that is. IgA is an antibody that's in salivary glands. It's also used to fight bacteria, and we'll talk more about what IgA antibodies are when we do the immune system later. And the enzymes salivary amylase and lingual lipase are also found in the salivary glands. Salivary amylase is used for carbohydrate digestion. Lingual lipase is for fat digestion, although the amount of fat that's actually digested starting in the mouth is negligible, so I don't even really consider that. I only mention it here because your book lists it. So really just salivary amylase is the one we'll concentrate on here. The secretions for the saliva is under parasympathetic control, of course, because it's all about rest and digest, remember. And those parasympathetic impulses travel through the cranial nerves number 7, which is the facial, and 9, which is the glossopharyngeal. Strong activation of the sympathetic nervous system can actually shut off production of saliva and therefore cause dry mouth. The food would move from the mouth into the pharynx. Now the pharynx actually consists of three parts: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx isn't considered part of the digestive tract because it's located up here above the soft palate, and it would be just considered a part of the respiratory system. The oropharynx is where the food would enter at the back of the throat and then move down into the region called the laryngopharynx because of its close association with the larynx. But of course, the food's not going to go down the larynx. That would not be good. That's when you start choking. The pharynx is also lined with stratified squamous epithelial. Again, the food's rough. We need to be able to withstand any abrasion, and so we have that nice stratified squamous epithelial to deal with that. The esophagus is the next structure the food would move into. The anatomy consists of a bunch of muscular tubes and folds. For expansion, you can see here, here's the lumen of the esophagus and all the folds that when food passes in, it has a way of expanding. Of course, the esophagus is also lined with stratified squamous epithelial. Again, rough stuff, need to protect from that. And then the upper part of the esophagus has a sphincter muscle called the upper esophageal sphincter. So it will be used when we talk about swallowing. And then, of course, there's another sphincter down between at the lower end of the esophagus, between that esophagus and the stomach. And so it's called the cardiac sphincter simply because of its close to the heart. So there's the cardiac. Or you can call it the gastroesophageal sphincter, which makes sense. Gastro referring to stomach, esophageal, of course, referring to esophagus. Or it'll be called the lower esophageal sphincter. So all kinds of different names for the same stupid sphincter muscle. Physiology of the esophagus is pretty simple. It's just for passage of food, which now we call a bolus. And then it has peristaltic waves to move that food along the esophagus so that it enters the stomach. And also the esophagus secretes mucus to aid for the movement of the bolus along the esophagus. Now, one of the diseases commonly associated with esophagus is called gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. I have lovely GERD. It's just fun. Not really, but what's happening here is that lower esophageal sphincter simply doesn't close effectively if you have GERD. So you've got all this acid in the stomach, should be kept in the stomach because that lower esophageal sphincter is closed. But in GERD, the esophageal sphincter doesn't close effectively, and so that acid content will move up into the esophagus. Now, the esophagus doesn't have the protection that the stomach does against the acid content of the stomach, and so that acid will erode the wall of the esophagus, and therefore you get heartburn. But that also can continue to damage the esophagus and cause a lot more problems. It can lead to a disease called Barrett's esophagus, where actually the stratified squamous of the esophagus is replaced with columnar epithelial, and that is not a good sign because that also, Barrett's esophagus, tends to lead to esophageal cancer. And we'll talk about the prevention of GERD, or the treatment of GERD, later when we talk about the stomach. So swallowing, or the fancy way of saying it, deglutition, consists of three parts. You've got, first part of this is going to be the buccal phase. So buccal referring to the mouth. So here, as you're ready, if you chewed your food up, that bolus of food is going to be pushed more towards the back of the throat by the tongue. So you can see the tongue presses up against the hard palate, and it forces that food back to the oral pharynx. The next phase is going to be the pharyngeal esophageal phase. Here, the uvula, that little thing that hangs down, which is the tip of the soft palate, it moves up, and then notice that it's going to block the nasal cavity here, so food won't go up in your nasal cavity. The tongue moves up and blocks against the hard palate, so the food doesn't come out your mouth. So the only direction the food has is to go down into the pharynx and start in the esophagus. in order for the food to pass, the upper esophageal sphincter here has to relax, and then the food can start entering the esophagus. The other thing that has to happen for this phase to go on is that the larynx here has to move up so that the epiglottis folds over and blocks food from entering into the larynx. So to feel that, you can actually touch your Adam's apple in your throat, that's part of your larynx, and then swallow. And you'll feel that Adam's apple moving up your throat as you're swallowing. And that's basically the idea, that the larynx moves up, the epiglottis folds over and blocks off food entering the larynx. Now, of course, you know that if you laugh or cough in the middle of the swallowing process, then food's going to go up your nose or out your mouth or down the larynx. So it's important that we kind of not laugh and not have that happen, because it's really uncomfortable to have pop go up your nose. The third part then is going to be considered what's going on in the esophagus is really part of the swallowing process, and that's basically getting the upper esophageal sphincter closed so the food can't go back up into the throat, and then the food would continue to go down the esophagus through using peristaltic actions. Now, next thing then is going to be the stomach. Now, the stomach consists of a bunch of rugae or folds, and you can see those here in the picture of the inside of the stomach. This allows the stomach to expand when we eat that big Thanksgiving dinner. Also, we've got an extra layer of muscles. Remember that we said that there's 2 layers of muscle in that muscularis externa. Now, the stomach is the exception to the rule. It actually has 3 layers, and you'll notice it has ones that are more longitudinal, ones that go across, and then you've got these oblique layers that just gives more ways to mix the food and churn the food up. The regions of the stomach include the cardiac, that kind of makes sense, is again located close to where the heart is. The fundus is this upper portion, the body is the main part, and then the pyloric region is down here close to what's called the pyloric sphincter. The pyloric sphincter here is what controls the movement of the food from the stomach into the first part of the intestine called the duodenum. And so we can close this to prevent food from going in, open it up, and we can squirt some of the food into the duodenum. The stomach is lined with columnar epithelial because we need to produce a lot of stuff now to protect the wall of the stomach, and that includes an alkaline or basic mucus to make sure, again, we're protected from the acid content of the stomach. Now, if you look at the stomach wall, it consists of a lot of little pits and glands that are used for secretions of substance important for digestion. So first, the gastric pit is this region just up here. It's kind of the neck of this whole apparatus. It has mucus cells. Again, those mucus cells are to produce an insoluble mucus that then coats the wall of the stomach, and that way it won't mix with the food and become part of the food. It just stays in this mucus layer along the wall of the stomach. The mucus also helps trap bicarbonates. We'll see what bicarbonates are in a minute. But the bicarbonates act as a buffer so that it buffers the stomach wall from the acid content of the stomach, so thereby neutralizing the stomach acid and protecting the stomach lining. The gastric gland is the deeper portion of the structures here, and it consists of several different cells. First, the parietal cells you got here, you can see scattered along. The parietal cells are responsible for producing what's called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor isn't anything to do with digestion per se in the stomach, but later in the intestines will be used to help absorb vitamin B12. The other thing also that the parietal cells make is the hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid is to lower the pH of the stomach to about 1.5 to 2. That is low enough pH that it'll kill most bacteria and start denaturing proteins. Now, if you remember what denaturing proteins are, it's basically you're taking that 3-dimensional shape of a protein and causing it to break up or unfold. And so the proteins are starting to open up, so then now we can get it to them with enzymes and start breaking some bonds. Also, hydrochloric acid helps break down the plant cell walls and connective tissue of meat. Think acid tenderizers that make your meat more palatable to eat. Take a cheap piece of meat, throw some vinegar or lemon juice on it. That will soften up that connective tissue, so now you have a much more tender chunk of meat. Same idea here. Also, hydrochloric acid is used to activate pepsin. Now, pepsin is the enzyme responsible for digesting protein in the stomach, or beginning in the stomach. It's actually produced by Chief cells, but Chief cells produce it as pepsinogen. Now, pepsinogen is the inactive form of pepsin. We have it secreted as pepsinogen in these Chief cells because as the pepsinogen moves up, we want it to be inactive because we don't want it to digest any proteins that are along the wall of these cells lining the gastric gland. We don't want it to be activated up until we get up here into the lumen of the stomach. So hydrochloric acid is used to convert that pepsinogen to pepsin. So the pepsin isn't activated until it's up here in the lumen of the stomach. I don't want pepsin down here because it'll digest up the cell wall or the cell membranes as it moves up and finally getting to into the lumen of the stomach. The other thing is that Chief cells make are lipases. Again, not very much fat. It's for fat digestion, but you're not going to see much fat digestion happening here either. We're really not going to get to fat digestion until we get to the small intestine. Then the last cells in these gastric glands are the enteroendocrine cells. These guys you can see down here at the bottom of the gastric gland. They produce the hormone gastrin. Gastrin helps stimulate secretions of hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen. It's all about revving the stomach up. It also produces histamine as a paracrine, and that's to help stimulate the secretion of hydrochloric acid. Now, how do we make the hydrochloric acid to be secreted in these parietal cells? That's the subject of this slide. So it's a little chemistry here involved. So we have CO2 circulating in our blood. That CO2 is going to diffuse into the parietal cells. Now, CO2 will combine with water and form carbonic acid. Okay? And it does this because of the presence of an enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. Now, that carbonic acid is a weak acid. If you remember your chemistry, a weak acid dissociates partly into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. Now the bicarbonate ions here will diffuse then out of the parietal cells and back in our blood and will act as a buffer for our blood and then help keep the blood pH steady. And we'll see this more at the end of the semester, how bicarbonates are used for that purpose. But if I'm adding a negative ion or an anion to my blood, I need to get rid of a negative ion to keep the electric balance in my blood normal. So I'm going to move chlorine into the parietal cell. So every bicarbonate that moves out, I get a chlorine to move in. Okay, that's why that's there. Now the hydrogen ions then are what's going to make the stomach content acidic. That's basically, think acid, think hydrogen ions. So those hydrogen ions then diffuse, don't diffuse, they're pumped through an ATP pump, or what they call a hydrogen pump, into the lumen of the stomach. And then the chlorine ions that we moved in simply diffuse into the lumen. But this is the important part. We get these hydrogen ions being pumped into the lumen by what we call a hydrogen pump here. And there's a little exchange of potassium along the way, but the potassium diffuses back, so that's not that important either. Now, histamine, as I mentioned before, that's secreted by those enteroendocrine cells, stimulates this hydrogen pump. So the more histamine I have, the more hydrogen ions I produce, or I pump, I should say, into the lumen of the stomach, and therefore the lower the pH. Now, if you have something like, if you get heartburn often, or if you have GERD, you want to take what's called a histamine receptor antagonist. So it's going to block the receptors and stop the production of, or the effect of histamine. And we have a lot of different examples of Pepcid AC or Tagamet or Zantac do that. And again, basically these histamine receptor blockers block the action of histamine. So therefore we don't produce as much hydrogen ions, which means our pH isn't as low. We don't have as many hydrogen ions. The pH in the stomach is higher and therefore less likely to cause irritation of the esophagus, and so you don't get the heartburn. However, acetylcholine and gastrin also stimulate this hydrogen pump here, and these histamine receptor antagonists aren't going to do any good against it because it only blocks histamine. So acetylcholine for parasympathetic stimulations, or gastrin that was released from those endocrine cells in the gastric wall, are going to enhance the production of hydrogen ions in the stomach. So we have another set of drugs to deal with that. These are called proton pump inhibitors. So things like Prevacid, Prilosec, and Nexium are all proton pump inhibitors. That is, they directly stop this proton pump or hydrogen pump, and therefore stop the movement of hydrogen ions into the lumen of the stomach. Therefore, your stomach pH is much higher. It's not going to cause any discomfort in the esophagus because of the reflux back in there. Okay. Now, some stomach disorders include gastritis. This is inflammation of the stomach wall. It could be due to ingestion of irritating substances or emotional and physical stress that may stimulate gastric secretions too early. Another disease is peptic ulcers. Peptic ulcers can either be gastric ulcers or duodenal ulcers. Gastric ulcers, of course, would be in the stomach. Duodenal ulcers would be in the duodenum, the first part of the small intestine. In most cases, the cause of peptic ulcers is due to a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, or short H. pylori. Only 10%, small portion of ulcers are caused by NSAIDs, or non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen or aspirin, or smoking or spicy foods or alcohol. So vast majority of us get peptic ulcers because of H. pylori. Now, all of us probably have H. pylori in our stomach right now. It's just some people are more susceptible to their effects, and the H. pylori, you can see in the picture here, manages to embed itself within the mucous membrane, and then it basically tears apart that mucous membrane, and then that allows the acid and pepsin of the stomach to penetrate and get to the wall of the stomach, where the pepsin and hydrochloric acid then causes the wall of the stomach to become inflamed, and actually those acids eat a hole in the stomach wall, and therefore you end up with this ulcer. Now, treatment, of course, could be antibiotics, kill off the H. pylori, or histamine receptor blockers, or really proton pump inhibitors as well, to reduce the acidic content of the stomach to help prevent any damage to the stomach wall. Now, regulation of gastric secretions is a rather involved process, and it's going to involve both nervous control in short and long-term reflexes, or hormonal control. And you can see here, just again to kind of summarize the nervous control, remember we have the short reflexes that just involve that enteric nervous system of the gut. Remember our gut brain here, and so we don't have to involve the central nervous system, or we can involve the central nervous system through autonomic reflexes and get them involved. So we'll see both. Now, this regulation of gastric secretions is under 3 phases, and we'll look at each one of these phases. There's a cephalic phase, a gastric phase, and intestinal phase, and luckily their kind of name makes sense. Cephalic phase is triggered by the head, by the brain, so think cephalic head. Gastric, of course, is triggered by the stomach, gastric, and the intestinal phase is triggered by, guess what, intestines. So let's look at each one of those phases. First, the gastric secretion regulation by cephalic phase is the first one. Here it's the sight, smell, taste, or even just thought of food. Gets a vagus nerve to send impulses down to the stomach and through the neural plexus of the stomach. It's going to get the mucus cells to secrete mucus. It's going to get the chief cells to produce pepsinogen. It's going to get the parietal cells to produce hydrochloric acid. And then, of course, the endocrine cells are going to produce the hormone gastrin. And we'll get back to gastrin in a little bit. But basically the idea is we're prepping the stomach for the food that we think is coming. So if we think about food, taste the food, smell the food, we're thinking, oh, I'm going to eat. So now let's get the stomach revved up so it gets ready in anticipation of food coming. The next phase then is the gastric phase. This one begins with the arrival of food into the stomach. So things like distension of the stomach, so you stretching the stomach out. Stretch receptors send impulses, notice through short reflexes, or elevated pH. So the food is not as acidic as the content of the stomach, so it's going to raise the pH, and then chemoreceptor sense that, and that causes impulses to be sent through our little gut brain. And the result of both of these things then is going to cause mucus cells to secrete mucus, chief cells pepsinogen, parietal cells hydrochloric acid, as well as getting the muscles to start mixing, to start revving things or churning things up. Okay, and then finally we're going to get the endocrine cells, of course, as well, to start producing gastrin. Now gastrin's job is going to be going over here and getting the chief cells and parietal cells to produce even more pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid, and gastrin goes over here and gets the smooth muscle to contract to get mixing waves. So notice here we've got this big revving up of the stomach. So this arrival of food into the stomach gets everything revved up. So think of this as just the stomach going crazy. It's going to rev up all kinds of secretion, gastrin getting more motility, also getting the cells to produce more of its stuff. We're revving things up, really getting the stomach to churn and mix up its food. Okay, now emotional upset, fear, anxiety will trigger the sympathetic nervous system, and that actually inhibits gastric secretions. And here's the problem with if you have food in your stomach and you get these emotional upsets, now you've got the sympathetic shutting things down, yet food's in the stomach, and that's what can actually lead to people throwing up when in these very anxious kinds of settings. The third phase of our gastric secretions can be the intestinal phase. This begins with the arrival of food in the duodenum, the first part of our small intestine. Now, I want you to think of this phase as the intestine saying, hey, stomach, slow down. Because what the intestine wants to do is deal with a little bit of food at a time. So things like lipids and carbohydrates and a decreased pH, because remember the stomach pH is very low, and so food entering is going to, from the stomach, is going to have a low pH. Those are the triggers for the intestine to secrete three different hormones. One is called CCK. The long name of that is cholecystokinin, which is a horrible name, so we're just going to call it CCK. Another one is GIP, which is gastric inhibitory peptide hormone, or we'll call it GIP, and then secretin is the third one. Now all three of these, notice, inhibit chief cells and parietal cells and inhibit peristalsis. So in other words, these three hormones come back to the stomach and say, hey, slow down. I don't want you going crazy here. I need to deal with a little bit of food that's been secreted into my intestine. Let me digest this up. Let me absorb this little bit of food down here, and then we'll talk. Then you can give me a little bit more. So you're going crazy. It's time to slow down. So these guys get the stomach to slow down. At the same time, stretch receptors and chemoreceptors that are sensitive to this stuff that arrived in the duodenum also trigger, again, short reflexes to get and inhibit the myenteric plexus. So that's the muscle-associated nerves that also are involved in peristalsis and mixing and churning the stomach. Again, inhibiting that route, slowing the stomach down. So now it's not churning, it's just not secreting stuff. It's kind of like on a hold pattern. So now the intestine has time to deal with that food that entered the intestine and get all the nutrients broken down and then absorb those nutrients. And then once that stuff's gone because the intestines processed it all, then it empties. There's no more secretion of these hormones, no more inhibition of the myenteric plexus. So now the stomach can rev back up again and get going. So the stomach will rev up, produce, digest more, mix more, produce more hydrochloric acid and pepsin, get things revved up, and then squirts more food into the intestine, and the intestine's like, okay, I got this part. Slow down again. Now slow down. I got to deal with that chunk of food. So it secretes more of the hormones. It inhibits the myenteric plexus, slowing the stomach down again. Processes this food. That food goes away. So now the hormones aren't secreted. There's no inhibition of the myenteric plexus. And it's time to rev the stomach up again. Stomach gets revved up. It starts digesting and undergoing mixing waves and peristalsis, squirts more food in the intestine, and then it's again, okay, let's put the brakes on. And that just whole process continues until finally you empty the stomach completely. Here's all the hormones that we've mentioned so far, and just a summary of what they do. So let's look at these. So gastrin can be secreted because of vagus nerve stimulation or food in the stomach, and all gastrin is about revving things up. It gets the stomach to stimulate gastric secretions. It gets increased motility on the intestine. It's also going to increase contraction of the intestines to move whatever food is still left in the intestine along, so we make sure there's plenty of room in the intestines for the new stuff coming. And also relaxes what's called the ileocecal valve, which is at the end of the small intestine, and so that food in the small intestine can move into the large intestine. Secretion, of course, is because of arrival in the duodenum, as well as CCK and GIP. Notice that it's all triggered because of food coming, or what they now call chyme, into the duodenum, and then they're all secreted by the duodenum, but they have different effects. So the secretin gets the pancreas to increase secretion of buffers to help neutralize that acidic content of the stomach. It gets the stomach to slow down. It gets the liver to increase bile secretion. We'll see how that functions in fat digestion in the next video lecture. CCK gets the pancreas to increase enzyme production to help digest the food in the small intestine. Gets the gallbladder to contract to actually increase amount of bile being secreted into the into the intestine. It gets the stomach again to slow down, and it gets the central nervous system to think it's not hungry anymore. This is the one I want to use to decrease appetite and maybe I'd lose some weight. GIP in the gets the pancreas to get release of insulin in anticipation of all that sugar we're going to absorb into their blood and deal with that, and the stomach again to inhibit the stomach production. So this slide just shows a summary of all the things that are going on. It really only picks up at the gastric phase. It skipped the cephalic phase here, so we're going to start here at the stomach. So when food arrives in the stomach, that triggers gastrin release. Gastrin in turn increases acid production and the motility, the mixing of what's going on in the stomach. So here we're revving the stomach up. Then the food moves, or chyme now they're going to call it, moves into the duodenum. The duodenum in response secretes GIP and secretin and CCK. GIP is in charge of getting insulin to be released. CCK and secretin result in the pancreas to do its exocrine functions of enzymes and buffers to be secreted into the small intestine. It also, notice, gets the liver and gallbladder to produce bile and eject that into the duodenum as well. Now, GIP, secretin, and CCK are also inhibitory on the stomach. Remember, they're all about slow the stomach down so that it's not getting the stomach to do too much too fast, so it can process that food slowly. Okay, so that way it has a chance, the duodenum has a chance to digest that food up and then absorb the nutrients, and then the food basically moves into the jejunum where other nutrients are absorbed and utilized. Now, what's absorbed in the stomach? Not much. No nutrients are absorbed simply because it's just too thick. There's not any receptors that allow food to be reabsorbed into the stomach. There's the thick mucus membrane or mucus layer in the stomach would prevent food from getting through. That's impermeable to water, so stuff simply isn't going to move through that mucus layer. And again, like I said, there's no receptors there to help assist the stuff to move through the wall of the stomach. And then digestion isn't even completed by the time the food leaves the stomach. It might be partially broken down by salivary amylase or pepsin, but that's not a whole lot. So we haven't gotten those molecules down into their monomers, into their basic building blocks yet. There's a couple things that are absorbed though in the stomach includes alcohol. This is basically because alcohol is fat soluble, so it can move through the mucus and the wall of the stomach very easily. And this is why you don't drink on an empty stomach, because if there's nothing in the stomach that the alcohol can mix with and slow down the absorption, then that alcohol is just going to quickly go through the stomach wall and boom into your blood, and the liver can't process the alcohol fast enough and you get drunk faster. So I guess if you want to get drunk, drink on an empty stomach, but again, I'm not promoting the use of alcohol in this classroom. Aspirin is also another thing that can be absorbed in the stomach because it is also lipid soluble, but it also alters the mucus layer and can cause damage to the epithelial, and so that's why aspirin or even ibuprofen can damage and lead to peptic ulcers. So that ends our look at the functional anatomy of the digestive system, at least going from mouth to stomach. And so the next video will pick up there and see what happens once the food enters the small intestine and travel on through to the large intestine.